So this is my early 1980s Eaton Road King, and for anyone else with an older bike, or really any bike with a 3-piece crankset, I'm going to show you guys how to upgrade that to a modern Shimano hollowtech crankset. So to do this job, you're going to need 3 things. You're obviously going to need your bike, and you're also going to need a new crankset. So this is a 2-piece crankset that I bought off Facebook. It was about $80. It's a FSA Gossamer. This is a Shimano hollowtech compatible crankset. So the reason it's called a 2-piece crankset is because there's one piece here, it has your chainring and sort of spindle, and then you have your opposite crank here. The 2 of them go through the bottom bracket together, and then they connect like this, and then you can pedal. The third thing you'll need is the bottom bracket itself. So that looks like this. This is the Shimano BBRS 500, which is a fairly inexpensive and simple bottom bracket that works with the hollowtech system. Another thing to consider is the width of the bottom bracket shell. The most common sizes are 68mm, 70mm, and 73mm. 68 is the most common on road bikes, and so you can just measure. This one is 68mm, so I made sure to get a 68mm bottom bracket. It's also a good idea to pay attention to the threading itself. So there's English threading and Italian threading. Most modern bikes will have English threading, but it's always good to double check. If you're not sure, you can just look online and find it that way. So the first step would be to remove the old crankset. So there's 2 different styles you could be dealing with. This is just an older style which you can remove with some wrenches, but if you have a slightly more modern bike, you might need a crank puller, which I'll also show you how to use. So with a 10mm socket, I can turn the crank until I find this nut here, and I can loosen that. So basically what that's done is unscrewed a pin that goes through the crank arm and around the spindle. So now that we've got that nut off, we can spin it around, find the other side of that pin. You can see it there, and we can slowly, gently start to tap up to get that pin out. Might take a bit of wiggling the cranksets back and forth, but you can see there's a lot more slack in here now, and that slack is caused by the pin getting looser, which I've now pulled out. You can see that there's nothing keeping these 2 cranks connected. This just spins freely around the spindle. So other side, same thing as before. I have a ratchet here that I can break that nut loose, and then we can just lightly start to hammer on that pin. And the crank arm can slide right off. Now, if your bike is a little bit newer, like this one, from the 90s or into the 2000s, you might still have a 3-piece crankset, but you'll need something called a crank puller. So this is another really inexpensive tool, and basically what you do is you thread it into the crank, and then you spin the center portion. This pushes in on the spindle and then pulls out on the crank itself. So to use the crank puller, we'll just pull off this cover here with just usually a flat screwdriver. So I'll just unscrew that cover, and then you'll see a nut inside. In my case, that is a 14mm nut, so I'm just going to remove that. Now with that nut removed, technically you could just pull hard on this crank and it would come right off. But chances are with these tapered bottom brackets, it's been on there for a long time, you're going to need the crank puller to pull it off. So there's 2 portions here. There's this inner portion, which I'll unscrew a bit so it backs off. And then this outside portion I'll thread into this hole. Now once I've got that holding enough threads, I can start spinning this inside portion again, pushing in towards the spindle, which will then pull out on the crank arm. So now I can just put a wrench on the end of this arm, pull that crank out of place. So it's usually pretty hard to start, but once you've got it pulled, it'll get easier. So I keep screwing that in, and then eventually the crank comes off, and then you can remove your crank puller. And then just like before, you'll repeat that process on the other side, and then you'll have your cranksets removed. Now coming back to the original bike, assuming you have the cranks pulled off now we can pull the old bottom bracket out. So to do that, you'll start with the non-drive side of the bike. You'll have this lock ring here. There are specialized tools that you should use to remove these, but I don't have them, so what I usually do is just grab a towel and then slowly undo the lock ring. Sometimes with a cloth you might need a wrench to go around it, but once you get it undone, it comes off pretty quickly. And then once that lock ring is removed, there's basically 2 cups that thread into the bottom bracket shell. I'm just gonna take a wrench and then slowly start to loosen it. And as you start to loosen this, you'll feel your spindle get looser and looser. So you can see inside the bearing cups and the bearings here that are still on the spindle. I can remove those, and then I can just pull the entire spindle out. And then on the drive side of the bike, there's one last cup to remove. So I'll just get a wrench to fit around that. So when I was talking earlier about the difference between English and Italian threading, you can see here that on the drive side, I'm actually turning it right to loosen it, which is why you have to pay attention to the threading. But once that's out, now would be a good time to actually go through and clean out these threads with some degreaser and a toothbrush, just to make sure that nothing gets damaged when we put the new bottom bracket in. So here again is the new hollowtech bottom bracket that I'm going to install. I made sure to measure the width of my bottom bracket shell, and I made sure to buy a road bottom bracket, which is standard 68 millimeters. So I'm going to pull these 2 ends apart, and I'm going to look at which one says right and which one says left. And depending on that, that'll tell us which goes on the drive side or the non-drive side of the bike. So this is the right side, so I'm going to slide that in here and start to thread that into place. Again, you can just use a towel to tighten that down, but if you can get these special bottom bracket tools that fit on here, and then you can just take a socket wrench and tighten it down that way. And then I'll just screw in the left side here, and as I screw that in, those 2 halves of the bottom bracket should click into place and become one. And then just give that a bit of a tighten. There's probably an official torque spec you should use, but as long as you don't over tighten it, you should be all right. Don't under tighten this either, otherwise when you're pedaling they could come undone. So make sure they're really snug down, but don't damage the threads. Now this is the most satisfying part, so we're gonna take the new 2-piece crankset, make sure it's around the chain, and then slide that through the new bottom bracket that we just installed. You can also install the chain if needed, just to get it out of the way. And then this should just slide right into place. And you can see it rotates much smoother than it did before. Now at this point I realized my microphone stopped recording, so I'm just going to finish the rest up in voiceover. What I'm screwing in now is just a preload cap. All this does is pull the 2 ends of the crank together and make sure they're situated exactly where they need to be before we tighten it down permanently. So once that's snug, I can start tightening the actual bolts themselves. It's important that you just tighten them a little bit on each side, slowly tightening them more and more. This is just to make sure you have even clamping pressure. Now, once that's on, you might find you have to tune your front derailleur a little bit just in case the alignment's off, but for the most part, that installation is done. So I hope you found that helpful. If you do have an older bike like this, I find this upgrade makes a huge difference in terms of the riding feel, and it really feels like a modern bike once you do it. If you can get parts secondhand, it's a great way of cheaply upgrading your bike and making it feel new again. I hope to make more videos like this as I do more builds or upgrades on my bikes over time, but in the meantime, thanks for watching. Bye.